or notepad.
No need for a notepad.
Both of them names on it, and that's about it.
All right, so we have a repeat guest on from HKS. You could see Alex, and you probably recognize him from the glasses in the first episode. But I asked Scott to join as well because Scott is vocal on the internet in terms of what he has seen in the in the field and has experienced. And I think it'll be a really interesting dynamic. And I want to sort of dig into it more, seeing how early, as I was saying, Alex, you get involved in these projects from day one when just a client has an idea versus 5, 6, 7, 8 years down the line when the projects are actually being built. And the more I kind of see this isn't sort of geographically dependent, but how long these projects actually take to come to fruition. So maybe what an owner had in mind at the time versus 5+ years later, sort of what's changing in the field. I think some trends you see now in Atlanta happening that might sort of feel dated in a sense, and you might have done it differently, but the time, that project was designed and bought out could have been years ago. And so things are kind of ever evolving and changing. So I'll stop there for a second and let you guys riff off that.
Well, one thing I'll say is that topic has been front and center on several of the recent pursuits that we've done is flexibility. How do we design flexibility into these master plans? Usually it's a project that has multiple phases, right? So they understand what they can afford to build now, day one. So, the first block is going to come out of the ground and be occupied in, 2 to 3 years. They can predict that. What they can't predict is what's going to happen 5 to 10 years down the road. So lots of developers are asking for, prove to us how you can design in flexibility so that the project can adapt to market changes in the future. And sometimes that's difficult to do with entitled projects, depending on the jurisdiction, because you might be beholden to a very specific program, and then you have to go back in later to, even if you've designed the project to be flexible, the local jurisdiction may not want you to change the program, like convert things from office to residential, for example. So it's not always easy depending on the jurisdiction. And I would say maybe something that would kind of make things a little bit more complicated for the things that we're doing is if you're doing a vertical expansion, like if you're designing a project that you can add another tower onto the podium. It's not so easy to change that in the future because of column grids and all that stuff, right? Even though the structure might be able to accommodate the tower going on top of it, it's a completely different grid if you've got a housing building versus an office building. I did have a couple of projects like that in New York that were changed, and in New York City, you can absorb some of that structural cost to transfer columns more than you can in other areas. So,
well, you're talking at the city level, and sort of having that influence on sort of the changing cityscape and how these buildings are being built. Because you have experience in the Northeast and you're now in the Southeast, how do those conversations differ? Have you noticed that some of the city councils or people have become a little more laxed, say, because of sort of macro challenges that we face in the industry and just a need for more housing or conversions or projects to go forward?
That's a good question. I don't think in recent history we at least not from our office, I don't think we've had a project that's been entitled that we had to change the program on. We've had a lot of projects that have been in design phases, not necessarily entitled yet, that we have to change the program, and that's a little easier of a conversation because the entitlement hasn't been approved yet, right? There may be internal agency politics at play with moving program around, but that's, I would say, easier to deal with than dealing with a planning board and a commission that's already approved something.
On the other hand, my experience has been more in terms of things that are designed and approved and under construction when the client realizes, oh no, I have to shift. I have to do something different to be competitive in this marketplace. 4 years ago when the pandemic hit, we were suddenly using designs that were traditional and under construction, and all of a sudden, we want to change all the entrance doors, all the elevators, to everything to be touchless. We want to change all of the mechanical systems to have more fresh air systems, and that becomes a scramble of a different type altogether because you're under construction and now you're cutting holes in floor slabs and doing different things. But like you touched on at the start, Adrian, I see some stuff that's a little bit different because you're painted in a different box when you're under contract already and you're under construction already. So
where does that disconnect stem from, and what has your experience been when you have a separate entity as the design architect and architect of record?
We got to figure out how to answer this.
Yeah. I've been on both sides of the table, so.
Right, and I've worked both with in-house designers at our firm and with third-party architects that the owner hires as an independent, member of the team. So you said disconnect. I want to try to figure out what you're asking.
Well, what is the thought? From what I see, hire a local architect of record because they're familiar with the entities at play and the contractors and the city and blah, blah, blah. But, I'm going to kind of hand select my design architect based on a certain style or whatever that might be. And then is there sort of a learning curve for each party to get comfortable with one another?
For sure. I think that more of my experience has been with an owner that wants to use a particular designer and not to hire an architect of record that is just from that city that has local juice or something. That certainly helps, in the big city where we operate in Atlanta. But I think more of it is kind of the national and global firm that we work for, and owners that maybe don't believe that the design firm has the horsepower, the ability to take on a big project in the schedules that we usually get, to just kind of dive in and go. Sometimes the design firms do not have as many people, for example, or as many people experienced in that building type, and we've done a lot of tall buildings. Is really what has us involved in a lot of projects.
When you do have two separate entities, do you think it creates more challenge than necessary? Can we make the blanket statement that the ideal circumstance is to have the same design architect and architect of record?
I don't think that that's necessarily true, because at a former office that I was at, we were design architect on lots of things and worked with local architects. And I think a lot of it just has to do with the relationship that is created and also I would say the openness that the client has with that relationship. Like some clients, can't really name the situation exactly, but I had a client who there was a design competition. They couldn't decide who they wanted to use. And so they said, okay, all three architects, here's all of your contact information. You guys go talk and come back to me with how you're going to do this project collaboratively together. And we did that, and it worked beautifully. Like there was no friction. There was like really great collaboration amongst the three firms. But there's been other situations where we've been forced into like an arranged marriage of architects, where we didn't have that ability to kind of really work things out amongst ourselves. And sometimes those go really well, and sometimes there's a lot of tension and frustration. So it really just depends on the kind of openness and collaborative, collaborative nature and collaborative mindedness of everyone who's involved, right? So
where does the line draw between, and maybe this is different on every project, but between kind of the deliverables and expectation between the two? I'm going to kind of make a brash statement and not name firms or names, but in my eyes, it's kind of like design architect comes up with a concept, drawings and something, and now architect of record has to actually figure it out and build it. Obviously, there's more to it than that, but is technically or typically design architect gets you through, is it schematics or design development, and then the architect of record takes over during the construction documents?
Typically, there's overlap. We'll get involved if it's an architect of record situation. We'll usually get involved in design development and start kind of truing up things like the floor plans and the cores and the operations of things. And then the design architect is, focusing on the forms and on the materials and the lobbies and the public spaces and things. But it's not a strong line of you stop here, you start here, because even with some of the partnerships I've worked on, we've had the design architect reviewing submittals and stuff as well. So they're all the way through construction administration and completion. So typically, though, if it's broken up in the AOR type of model, the design architect is stepping back after DD, and then we're carrying the load in the CD and CA phase for sure.
So
it definitely varies. That overlap might happen earlier with some clients, right? So it varies a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to see the other perspective, because I would think having a single entity would sort of give the owner more clarity or buy-in, that they're liable for what they're designing and going to make sure it's executed in the field. I mean, what level of, and can I put you two in the separate sort of category of, like, we're going to pretend like Alex is more the design architect and Scott's more the architect of record? Is that sort of the hat you wear within the office?
Well, just to clarify, my role for 20 years here has been as a construction contract administrator. I never knew you could do such a thing as a specialty, but I love to be in the boots and on the job. And I post frequently. The best part of the job is, being on the job site. So that's where I migrated toward. So I'm kind of getting in technical reviews in the CD phase, and even sometimes at the very earliest in the DD phase, just sort of as a check, but more the tech side than the design side. So.
I mean, what I would say is we definitely prefer to do full service. And one of the things we're trying to push, I think this is probably true in all of our offices, is much more of an integrated approach. So like I've worked at other offices where the design department was on a completely different floor than the people who were producing construction documents. And so that segregation of scope was ingrained in like the way that the office was laid out, and we're trying to not do that. Like, we want to have, when we're doing design kickoffs, we want to have our technical people in there with us, to make sure that we're not designing something that, like, Scott has seen 10 times happen the wrong way in the field, right? Like, we want to have that information up front when we're designing. And so I think that this would be true, like whether the arrangement is full service from HKS or if it's a collaborative, design architect, executive architect situation, you want to have that technical and field information as early as possible up front. And that's when I think that those design architect relationships work the best, is when everyone's collaborative and talking about things at the beginning, which is why we prefer to do full service, because we can control that internally. We can't always control that when we're in a design architect, executive architect situation.
So a lot of the issues that you see in the field, Scott, are you still surprised today, or do you see the same exact things on project to project to project?
No, I don't see the exact same things on project to project. Occasionally, yes, but in general, at the start, our company has a construction services group, and we're kind of, it ebbs and flows as far as how the people in my role kind of blend into teams, and giant projects versus small projects, things are very different. But I keep my train of thought, and I just lost it altogether. Ask me again.
Seeing particular things in the field, and I mean, for instance, I've seen pictures of the electrochromic project you guys are working on, and that's a whole new challenge and thing in itself. So that's kind of interesting. But if that type of project's a one-off and there's surprises and sort of a learning curve associated with that, versus other projects where exactly where there's going to be a problem at that interface detail, at the transition, at the amenity space, or just things that can be resolved way earlier on.
I got you. Yeah, no, and that's what I was taking off toward an answer. I think that the things that you see more times, my goal is to share that with the greater team so that it's not something that only Scott knows. I from some very early meetings with the construction services group, somebody would say, "Oh, that happens on every job," and I for a couple of years I was like, "Yeah, that stinks. That does happen on every job." And then I realized, that if that's happening on every job, that's really on me to give that feedback so that it doesn't happen on every job anymore. And I think through the years that has changed a little bit because I try to be very open, and sharing. But I'm not the only one. It's really tough in a company of 15 or 1,600 people to spread the knowledge. It's really one of our hardest things to do. Everybody's working hard on things at the same time, and everybody doesn't know what everybody else has experienced. So trying to figure out ways to share that is tricky. But I don't see necessarily the same things happening all the time. There are the same parameters. We've talked, the three of us have talked even online about the topic of, unitized versus stick-built, and how Atlanta is still a stick-built town for reasons. I mean, the reason here is it's less expensive to go stick-built. My experience in unitized is very small, relatively. It's one giant project that we used it on, and I learned some new things for sure. But I don't think that we necessarily have things that happen as a just by virtue with another project that this happens all the time. I really, really try hard not to let that happen. If you learn
this construction services group, I'm guessing it's sort of unique to you and a few individuals, but somewhat unique to HKS. I mean, what level of involvement do you think an architect should have sort of throughout the build? In New York, we have special inspections. So you have an independent inspection agency coming on and covering things like welding and fire safing and sprinklers and blah, blah, blah. So it's sort of a delegated sort of responsibility for multiple entities to have eyes and ears on the project throughout. But especially in Atlanta, is a lot of that put on the architect?
No, we have the same thing. I mean, the building code has the special inspection provisions, and a lot of spec sections have that as required by IBC, some things locally as well. But it's, I guess, the role that I'm in that I enjoy, that I was kind of made for, is, we have ownership of the entire project. All the consultants are our consultants, and we have to basically have somebody making sure that the mechanical engineer and the civil engineer and the structural engineer are actively involved in the project. And it's not just sending them RFIs and passing the answers back, it's reading them, and it's understanding what's going on and being on the lookout for things that are going to cause us, pain ultimately. So a lot of my role is that, as well as keeping all these people that might be all over the country, all over the world, informed of how far along are they. The elevator guy doesn't come in until the elevators are in the hoistways, which is pretty far down the road. And that guy did his design or wrote his spec 3 or 4 years ago. And you got to say, hey, and there's ways of keeping people informed. There's webcams, there's, passing on the contractor's weekly reports. There's my own visits, but I like to write on the report, sending them in an email and say, hey, look at the pictures, have some idea of where we are on this project, and let me know when your contract says you have X number of visits. So I'm kind of in charge of making sure they're showing up, looking at the things. I mean, there's a limit to what you can look at, but you want to make sure that, I'm not out there counting the number of junction boxes, but there are times in a certain space that's really, really important to count the junction boxes. And whether I'm doing that or whether I'm calling Sparky to come do that, that's something that I'm going to do as the design professional on the job.
But like as a good example of that, your site observation notes went out recently, and the landscape architect read them, and he said, wait, the crane is going to go away in a couple of weeks. We don't have the trees up on the amenity roof yet. We need to coordinate that and make sure that it stays there long enough, because otherwise they're going to have to carry these 16-foot tall trees up the stairwell of a 10-story podium. So those things got caught in time, and there were no problems, right? So
when I was doing special inspections, I remember internally the duty or responsibility was comment on performance implicated items, not aesthetic. That's for the architect. And so just focusing on the facade for a second, how do you manage sort of aesthetic expectations and receiving samples early on versus what's actually built in the field, coupled with, if a visual mock-up is even done or not? What has your experience been with that?
Always do a mock-up. Always do a mock-up. I think any time I've been involved in a project that has not done a mock-up, there's always been a reason someone regretted not doing that once they started seeing stuff installed on the building. So, the most recent project we did a mock-up of, we probably went out there 3 times to see different little adjustments on it, and they probably, to the average person, they were minuscule and they probably wouldn't have noticed it. But we had a very engaged client, which is great because we got exactly the right detailing, exactly the right colors on this building, and I think everyone's going to be very pleased with it. But
I think, Alex, in the last decade, things have changed. We're doing things paperlessly now. We're not passing 10 copies of shop drawings and having anybody in the office to come and copy the comments that you made to get the number. We're doing it all electronically now. Samples, though, you can't do samples electronically, although we do take a picture front and back so that you can read the label in the picture, and that becomes the memorial copy. But there's still the physical samples that ride around in my car for a couple of years or sit at my desk. I like to have the official copy be in the job site because it's on the job site, and if I'm going out to check something, I grab the one off of the shelf in the job trailer and walk around, so that it's not something I'm carrying in a backpack, around with me and riding the train with it. But those things are, collaboratively, on the job that Alex is referring to that we have going on in West Midtown. He kind of made up a palette summary that was really for the owner, and it was really part of our own design process. But he handed it to me and says, "This is what we're going to have, and this is how these all come together." And we ended up going to visit the manufacturing yards for some of these things, and comparing the kind of palette with the actuals, and just looking to make sure that the thin bricks that are laid into the precast, for example, we're checking all of those and looking things over. So I think that even though we're doing things paperlessly for the record, there's still the touchy-feely stuff that you have in your hands. And then, I alluded to it earlier where you change things along the way. The project that we're talking about had a decision made kind of after we had the glazing shop drawings. It's a glass curtain wall building, a stick-built glass curtain wall building, and the decision was made to change to electrochromic glass. The IRS regulations that changed that made it, possible to push this into the project and not just have it cost a whole lot more through the credits or rebates or whatever the function is. Don't even know for sure. So we made a major move to change to the electrochromic glass, which had implications on the mechanical systems that were designed and the air handlers that were sitting on the floor or in a warehouse already. So that was just standard operating procedure. We make a decision, find out what it's going to cost, and either do it or don't do it, and keep moving.
Tons of wiring and electrical changes.
That's right.
Scott was able to go through and analyze all those things. Like, it was going to create the potential for poor aesthetics inside the building, also a building that was going to primarily be exposed on the interior. So we were able to coordinate all of that so that it feels like it was designed from day one, right?
Yeah, I was walking. Go on, you finish.
Well, yeah, Alex touched on a bunch of those things. I actually got to go see the manufacturing facility and kind of gain a great appreciation for the technology and stuff, and see their demonstration lab and see how this stuff all works. Because it was a first. I mean, it was, it's not open yet, but it's under construction right now, and they've got probably 90% of the glass units in the building, and they're going to start to put in the smarts and the guts and all the data systems and start programming and testing it and setting the limits for each elevation.
We started the conversation talking about how easily transformable a building is, or if you want to change the use type of the space. Do you think thought is, sure, some thought, but how much thought is put into sort of the lifespan of the electrochromic glass and what the second iteration of that may look like?
Trick question.
That's a tough one. I mean, I think it's electrochromic glass. I'm seeing, a lot of people, it's not really applicable to Atlanta, but in the Northeast have a lot of interest in vacuum glazing. But the question of how long is the hermetic seal going to be good for, and what happens when we need replacement units, and what does this look like 20, 30 years down the line? When I think anytime you start with some new form of building or technology, it's only fair to ask those questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think like we had to make a couple of modifications to the system in order to accommodate this glass, but it was more related to the overall square footage, like the size of the glass,
Mhm.
right?
There's size limitations, right, per light.
Size limitations that shouldn't affect anything in the like. Let's take kind of an extreme example. If the system were to fail and they wanted to replace everything, there should be no problem with that, with replacing the glass with a.
Meaning you could replace dynamic glass with static glass.
Right. I think, anticipating future technology upgrades would be difficult to do. There is some of the glass, some of that electrochromic glass does require a different spacer, right? The spacer dimension is slightly different.
Mm-hmm.
So you might have limitations on, let's say, 20 years down the road in who you change the manufacturer to. If that thing fails, you might be limited again to a smaller amount of replacement manufacturers. That would be the only thing I could think of but that's kind of an extreme case, right? So
let's focus on windows for a second. So I was actually walking last night. It's nice up here in New York. So I was walking downtown by the water, and there was windows aside for a second. There was an old hand-laid brick building with a nice stone podium, probably in the early 2000s. And I just noticed myself, they did a really nice job of the stone at the podium. So it's like it was all I was staring at, where typically I'm looking at up at the facade. Sometimes I have to remember that 99% of people don't even look at any of the stuff that we tend to nitpick. So when it comes to glass, what are some things that kind of grind your gears, or that you look at? Maybe it's in terms of visual distortion or issues you see on other projects that you do everything that you can to avoid on your projects, or design preferences that you try to steer.
Too many to name.
Yeah, I mean, I had one that had what looked like a lot of distortion. We got the Osprey readings off of the line, and it said it was well within limits and stuff, and it was truly a function of what was reflected and what the proximity to the building next door. And you start looking at that building and thinking, oh my gosh, when I'm driving, I see a certain reflection, and I don't like the way it looks. And then you continue driving, and you look at the next building, and it's got the exact same thing going on. And it was really a case of there isn't a building across the road yet, closer. And so you see this longer vista, and you start to see what looks really blurry, which, I'm super sensitive to now. I've talked with our tech resources group about what can we do. And the feedback that I'm getting is that, you can spend a whole lot more on glass. You can throw out a lot more of the stuff that comes off the line and tighten your tolerances dramatically, which is driving the costs up, which makes the project not happen. So there are trade-offs. That was one. We did have some very high-performing glass on a project.
I asked that question before you continue, because you talked about having samples and setting the expectation, but a 1x1 sample might not necessarily be reflective of a 5x10 light.
Not in any way. That's right.
Well, and that project had a pretty elaborate mock-up also, which it was never noticed in because of the context, right? Like, you're not seeing it, 10 stories in the air with nothing around it. You're seeing it at grade. It's only 15 feet tall.
And we deliberately made the mock-up facing, north and east, in some orientations to specifically look at things. But like Alex said, then what you see when you're driving in the reflection of the sky, you don't see the distortion, but the reflection of the building next door, you do see it. And that's from a mile away as you're driving toward it. So these are things that, we had actually had a rendering done that showed the reflection of the buildings, and the decision was made when the renderings are done, let's not show those buildings. We want to show our building. And it was kind of humorous the way that turned out.
So you find it's cost driven. It's not necessarily supply chain driven.
I think ultimately, yes. Ultimately, if you are, buying thicker units with a thicker outer, like a different makeup, either thicker glass or laminated glass or something that you can get a little more ultra flat, you're going to spend more money. And in a big urban office market, there is a price point beyond which it just doesn't make sense from a business decision. So
it's interesting you talk about the flatness. The other thing, you have the flatness. People don't really think about, not down there, but up here we see a lot of triple glazing and the potential reflectivity of it, because you're looking through 3 surfaces now,
right,
not 2. And yeah, that's a major disconnect, because any architect's office in the world, you go in and you see these 12 by 12 samples, but
that's right.
Under high wind loads on a high-rise project, the pillowing, anything else you might see, it's just night and day difference. So I feel like it might be a poor representation of what you're actually going to get.
Yeah, I think the other thing is tinted glazing. It's something that, if you use a kind of a darker gray tint glass, it helps with the energy performance. There's I believe, a misconception from some of the developers that that's going to feel a lot darker from the interior, right? Like, there's the perception if the building is dark on the outside, it's going to feel dark on the inside. And I had a project in New York City. We had done a previous building with a gray tint, and the glazing specification used the word gray in it. We went to that building, we looked at it from the inside, looked out, it was completely fine. The developer refused to use the glass that said it was gray. So we found another glass specification, did not use the word gray in it at all, but it was exactly the same light transmission, and they approved it, and the building is perfectly fine. But there was this perception that it was going to be too dark because it looked dark on the exterior. And I think, properly understanding the kind of perception and the differences between, what it feels like inside the building versus the exterior is something that's important for everybody to understand and maybe educate our clients on. That was kind of a funny instance where, exact same specification, just from a different manufacturer who didn't use the word gray in the title of the spec. And we were able to get what we wanted on both, the interior and the exterior. And,
that sounds good.
Yeah.
I actually don't know the answer to this question. I just asked somebody internally. They didn't know either. If you were to have to use laminated insulated glass on a project, is it preferable to have the interlayer on the inboard side or the outboard side?
I've always seen it on the outboard, but in my experience, I worked for HKS in Florida first, and there was a lot of storm resistance things for hurricanes and stuff, and that might have been the driver for that. I think for skylights, you want it on the inside because if something breaks, it doesn't fall. So there's different reasons in different locations.
Depending on the requirement. I meant from an aesthetic standpoint, if maybe having it on the outside would eliminate some of that sort of help with the flatness.
Probably, because then
I think for sure,
yeah,
most definitely.
Because it's the solution to that kind of rippling effect is to stiffen that outer light in some fashion. So.
What about operable windows? How are they perceived in the market?
Mostly that's a regional. There's a big regional difference, I think.
I'm talking Atlanta, multifamily Atlanta.
Well, and jurisdiction, right? Atlanta does not require it. And I would say that there's a mixture. Like, it's not consistent in Atlanta. I'm looking at the building next to us, which is a condo, and it has no operable windows anywhere. There are other buildings, recently constructed that do have operable windows. It's not a very consistent thing. I think, and it depends on the developer. Like, some developers appreciate and understand the desire to have the ability to do that. It also helps with certain air quality kind of control issues if you're going for different certifications.
I asked because
right? So
we're in a
of course it's
right now. You open the window right now, you're gonna have a yellow apartment. And that
We
happens.
have it, it's a code requirement for us. And I was walking around the other day at 60 and sunny on a Sunday afternoon, looking up at the buildings. All the windows were closed. And I like getting fresh air in the unit, but there's no way around it with our code. And so that's when I wonder, when it's not required, how people see it, if they see it as a nuisance or just a premium that's not worth it.
Yeah, I can't remember on the most recent projects we've done. We have had the contractors separate out the cost of operable windows versus not, and it's definitely an increase, but I don't recall it being an exorbitant number. So, depending on what the market conditions are, it's easier to swallow.
And I know there are conditions in which it's required as well, because in a recent downtown urban multifamily project that we did, we do have operable windows. It's either got a balcony or it's got a little token operable window with a screen that you can only open up 4 inches or something, for life safety reasons. So I'm not sure the exact cutoff.
Token operable window. It's the first time I heard that.
That's
Yeah,
right.
no, I basically meant as a means of natural ventilation. And terrace space with a swing door, of course, I could see that. But if you're cooking or you want fresh air, and what really is driving the market? I mean, I think in a hot environment, a cooling dominated climate like Atlanta, it's probably solar heat gain. And so you probably got to make sure you have the right coating to make sure those interior spaces are comfortable.
Mhm. I mean, I would say it's a similar difference with slab edge covers, right? Depending on the region you're in. In New York City, we always put insulated slab covers on the buildings, but we've done analyses in the South, and there's like a cost benefit analysis that they did. It doesn't make sense because we don't have as high of cold swings in the South. It was for projects here in Atlanta and in Arizona. It didn't make sense to do slab covers, right? So depending on the region you're in, a lot of those details will vary based on the region. So.
And I could imagine there's a clear line where that changes. Maybe not when you get up to Nashville, but when you get up to DC, I mean, it's talking in your DC with your DC office. I can't imagine them not having insulated slab edge covers, especially in the winter months.
Yep.
Anyway, well, I appreciate you guys coming on. I'm sorry that I lost my video, but that was a fun conversation.
Thanks for having us again.
Yeah, enjoyed it.
All right, I'll talk to you guys soon.
We'll
All
talk
right.
to you. See you.
Bye.